Hello. Let me know if I talk either too quietly or too loudly, please. This is, it works on my machine because I'm bad at titles. And I am Christopher Torgelson. And we have to acknowledge the sponsors, as in the keynote. So the diamond sponsor, Acquia. You know you all have to memorize these by the end of the day, right? The platinum sponsors, Wunder and Platform.sh. And the gold sponsors, Commerce Guys, 1x Internet, Bloom Idea, Everest, I can't read that on my screen, Nuvol, Thunder, and Amazy Labs. So to begin with, a very small amount about me. Again, my name is Christopher Torgelson. I am largely a Drupal developer. I do Drupal modules and builds and theming, most of that stuff. And besides that, I do some of the automation and some of the ops work at the place where I work. My Twitter handle is up on the screen there, and there you can find a pinned tweet with these slides, or a slightly older version of these slides, a code repository containing all the code that I'm going to talk about here, a sort of working sample of what I'm going to talk about, and a link to a blog post that I also wrote about this. So if I miss anything in this, hopefully it's there in the blog post or in the README, and if it's not, please feel free to reach out and ask. So I said I do a bunch of Drupal stuff and some automation work, and I do it for these people, Chromatic. Chromatic is yet another distributed company with people mostly in the United States, but with a tiny foothold of Canadians in Europe. So I work out of France, and one of my colleagues is in Estonia. And they're my sponsor. So. While reviewing this, I realized that I use about 6 words over and over and over again. So I thought it might be a good idea for me to say just what I'm talking about when I say them. So a short glossary to begin with. So when I say dev, I'm just talking about any local development machine, something that runs on a workstation, on a laptop, something like that. I realized only later, of course, that some people will have remote servers running development code, and they'll refer to it as dev and have different names for things. So when I say dev, that's all I mean. It's just the local machine. And to contrast with that, when I say prod, I'm just talking about a remote machine. So something out there on the network somewhere. It might actually be the production server. It might be a QA server, or again, this dev server. Just something that's not running locally on your local infrastructure. For the next one, I'll say provision a lot. And here I just mean building out and configuring a server, sort of up to but not including the point where you set up an application like Drupal. So getting the environment ready, getting the infrastructure ready is what I mean. And then again, to contrast with provisioning, I talk about deployment or deploy. And that's where I'm talking about building out the actual application itself onto the infrastructure. And finally, when I talk about automated deployment, all I mean is manual deployments by robots. I don't know, when I first started doing the automation work, it was a little bit mysterious until I realized that it was the same work I'd been doing for years and years, just getting something to do it for me. So that's the glossary out of the way. So I'm going to begin with what I hope is a pretty uncontroversial statement and say dev is hard. And what I mean by that is the local environment is kind of a pain. Just show of hands, does anybody here have an irritating local development environment? Yeah, a couple. I'm glad it's not just me. So there's a number of reasons for that. Sometimes we're just obligated to use a certain setup for client reasons or other reasons. But a lot of the time, it's just because we don't pay any more attention to it than we absolutely have to. And we wind up with 10 developers and 11 different local sort of environment setups. I don't think I'll be telling any untoward secrets if I say that at Chromatic, there is more than one local environment in use. Besides the fragmentation, another thing that is a little bit aggravating about these most local solutions is they usually require some amount of manual configuration. Even if with some of the more sophisticated tools like Drupal VM, you still need to write a configuration file. And that's kind of, in my opinion, it's kind of wasted work because that doesn't help you at all on prod. And what we're all working towards is getting stuff out in public, out on prod. So that's the uncontroversial thing. So this, I think, might raise an eyebrow or two. I'm sitting here and I have the nerve to tell you that the production environment is easy, or at least if it's not easy, it's not as hard as the dev environment. And the reason I say that is, another show of hands just to see if we can prove my point. Does anybody have a really nice automated prod deployment process? Yeah, a couple. Yeah, it's sort of nice. But the reason for that is that this is of necessity. It's largely a solved problem. It's a problem that we can't afford to ignore, and so we don't. And when we build these things, we kind of make sure that they work. They get sort of the attention they need to turn into solved problems because that's sort of it's the job that we're getting paid to do, basically. So my solution, based on these two premises, I conclude that maybe instead of what we do now, we should do dev like prod. So what I'm going to claim here is that we should, where it's possible, and I'll come back to that in a second, but where it's possible, we should use the same kind of tools and processes for setting up development instances that we do for prod. Specifically, sorry, I'll back up a step. There are certain benefits. If we can do this, there are certain benefits to it, and those are the initial setup is easy, so we can eliminate some or all of that manual deployment step. That manual configuration step where we write configuration, we write custom local versions of settings.local.php, things like this. Secondly, and similarly, aside from the setup, when we break something, if we can just run a deployment to set up a local instance, then the rebuilding is easy as well. And then thirdly, and maybe less important, but I think valuably, we can get a bit of deployment visibility amongst developers who don't normally see any of that side of things. Hopefully without requiring them to become experts in it as well. So, spoiler, I'm going to give the game away right at the start here. This fixes everything. It probably doesn't, but it fixes a lot of things. It helps with a lot of things. And by the way, I mentioned where possible. So aside from instances where we simply must use a certain local setup because our customers do, or for other reasons like that, or somebody else's team that we have to interface with does. Aside from in those situations, I lost the plot. Let me go back one step. I said where possible. So aside from those situations, it's often the case that what we're standing up is a more or less monolithic server, like a single sort of LAMP server that runs Drupal. Maybe it has a little bit of extra complexity in a related Solr server or Elasticsearch, something like that. But for those pretty common cases where we just have to do that, we can do the local job, do the same thing locally. We, for example, we have a lot of big sites where this won't work, but we also have a lot of little sites where this is exactly how it works. And these tools work really well in that circumstance. So if we're going to talk about this, we will need to know we'll need to have a list of requirements to tell to see if the tools that we've got available can accomplish the job. In general, we're going to want to run specific tasks, and then we're going to want to run on specific hosts. So I'll unpack that a little bit. So whatever solution we come up with for this kind of problem, to allow us to use the same set of tools, the same set of processes locally as remotely, we've got to be able to configure servers and deploy applications. So this is that provision and deploy part that I mentioned a bit earlier. Secondly, we've got to be able to run tasks on the controller, on the dev environment, and in the prod environment. And just a note, by the controller I mean wherever the job is running that's doing this deployment. It might be for the dev instance, it'll be here on your laptop or workstation. But for prod, it might be a build server, Jenkins, a CI server, something like that. Third and almost last is we need to be able to run tasks with host-specific variables. This is one of the big ones because we want to be able to avoid having to do these sort of different configurations for different boxes. Or at least we want to be able to do it once and only once for the whole team. And then point 3.5 is a subset of number 3. We have to be able to do the same thing with secrets. So there's any number of secrets that we have to deploy to both kinds of environments, database credentials, maybe AWS credentials, SSL keys, SSH keys, all sorts of things which we might need to deploy to both environments or to only one environment, or to deploy different versions of these to each environment. Moving on to tooling, I gave the game away a little bit with the spoiler. So one of these tools is going to be Ansible. But before we get there, the tool that I'm most familiar with for doing this kind of thing for standing up a dev server is just Vagrant. Everybody heard of Vagrant? Yeah, in general. I'll say a word or two. It's just a way of providing a virtual machine on your system with usually a fairly small text-only configuration. So it can be stored in the repository, sort of shared, transferred from person to person and used, and you have a reasonably reliable and reasonably reproducible way of having the same server for yourself and your colleagues, and where relevant for your customers. So virtual machines, code-only configuration. The file that defines the server is called a Vagrant file, and it's just called out with an arrow in the slides. When I do that in these slides, it's a link in the slides to where to the file or the directory in question in the code repo. So if you download the slides and look at them, you should be able to link to directly to the code. And a Vagrant file just might look as simple as that. That's as small as I was able to make it. Generally, there'll be a bit more. You'll want to do more things than simply turn a server on, which is all that's really doing. But that's, unless there are questions later, that's all I'll really have to say about Vagrant. And most of the rest will be about what features Ansible has that allow us to sort of solve those four problems, or those four requirements. So, how's our knowledge of Ansible? Pretty good? Okay, we'll continue. So, at the base, Ansible is a task runner. Red Hat, they call Ansible automation glue, which is, I guess, good marketing, but it's also, it's reasonably descriptive. It's a tool that lends itself well to knitting together or joining together different parts of a process that you might want to automate. Just for example, during a build, you might need to run a task like a composer task or something, and then to deploy the code base. And Ansible can orchestrate these things for you. It's kind of good at that. Where it differs from other task runners is that it's specifically meant to sort of work over SSH, so that you can run tasks on other machines as well as on your local machine. Ansible, it's a task runner, and it's got sort of a hierarchy where tasks are organized into what they call plays, and plays are then organized into what they call playbooks. So one or more tasks to a play, one or more plays to a playbook. And again, in the sample repo, all this stuff is contained in a folder called DevOps. So let's have a quick look at a task in Ansible, see what the tasks are all about. At the simplest thing, Ansible provides kind of a wrapper, a way of executing commands on the shell. So a lot of what you'll see in this repository, and what's fairly common in Ansible playbooks everywhere, is seeing commands that you might be familiar with, like drush updb or something. But besides that, it's got a lot of purpose-built modules that do more specific jobs. So crypto modules and database modules, modules for working on the file system, modules for sort of moving things around, synchronizing between servers, between hosts. Again, you can find some of this in the DevOps module, DevOps directory. And so a basic task just looks like this. They usually have a name, which is output when the job actually runs, so you get a nice sort of code documentation and output at the same time. It's got a command, when we're just running a command, this is. So this one's running a gulp build task. And then just a little bit of configuration for the task itself. So in this instance, we're changing the working directory just to where the package file lives. And lastly, here I mentioned that we need to be able to run tasks on the controller. This delegate to line is one of the ways that can help you do that in a task. Moving up the hierarchy, so I said that tasks are organized into plays and then plays into playbooks, so they're just collections of different sizes. The playbook in the sample repo is called deployment.yaml, and it's got two different plays in it. This is just one of them. I didn't want to hit you with the entire file. But this is the play that's responsible for the deployment task here. So this is the piece of code that's going to actually build the application. Jumping ahead, the application I'm building here isn't Drupal. It's a one file static website. It's easier to show the different sort of how these different pieces come together here than it would be in something as big as Drupal. But everything here applies more or less directly to Drupal or other PHP apps or other web apps. So there's really two things in this code sample that are worth paying attention to. The first is that hosts line in the second line there that has a list in it, a YAML list of deploy dev and deploy prod. Those are in effect, those are the servers that this playbook knows about and that it can sort of do tasks on. Further down there, there's a line that says tags, and it says deploy, and that's the job of this play, is deploy. The other play not shown here has a tag called provision. It's the one that does the server build. This is the one that deploys the application. So I'll start with these tags. The tags are our method of figuring out, or of restricting rather, which tasks get run at a specific time. So we decide which plays or which tasks run on the hosts that the playbook knows about. And when we call this stuff from the command line, there's this switch that we can use to specify which tags we want Ansible to pay attention to. Again, where it's located in the repo. So this looks like this. So we're building out a little bit on my this fixes everything command, but mostly we're just making it a bit more specific. So we're telling it, please just run the tasks related to deploy. And I won't make you watch this whole movie, especially since it's a bit slow to run. Oh. Okay, that's a good place to stop. So what's worth paying attention here to is that there are two different lines on the screen that say play. The first one and then the second last one there. The first one, play provision hosts, hasn't done anything because we have issued the tag, that -t flag up there. We've given it the deploy flag tag, so it's only going to run the deploy tasks. That's why it's skipped over the first play altogether. Another thing that's worth paying attention to, because it becomes relevant in the next couple of slides, is that below that gathering facts line there are two different hosts. Those are both of the hosts that were in that list in the play. They're both shown. It's paying attention to both of them. And if I were to let this continue, it'll start running tasks on them. But we don't need to watch all the way through. So this means with our list of requirements, we said we needed to be able to configure servers and deploy applications, and we need to be able to do those things separately, and we can cross that off. So because we're now with this tags feature, we're able to sort of target specific jobs. We can do the deployment, we can do the configuration, the server configuration, we can do them together, we can do them separately, one or the other, according to what we need to do. So that's going to take us to point 2, where we have to be able to run the tasks on different hosts separately. And the Ansible feature that enables that is called groups, where we just define, again, which hosts the tasks will run on and which hosts the playbook actually even knows about in the first place. And again, like with tags, we've got a command line switch that we can use to specify where we want something to run. And there's this file called the inventory file in Ansible. It's usually named hosts.yaml. And here you can just see we've got this deploy group in it. Oh, that is a bit small. I hope it's visible at the back. But there's a group here called deploy dev, which contains, in this instance, a host. That's that IP address and that host name below there. And this is how we define groups for Ansible to make use of in the first place. And then that command line switch is what we use to target them. So another little movie somewhere. If it will run. So first thing to notice is we didn't specify a tag, so it's actually running this provision task this time, where it didn't the first time. But moreover, there we go, we can stop it there. If you recall, I asked you to pay attention to the fact that there were 2 hosts named on each task in the last time. In this time around, with the limit flag, it's only running them on our local instance, so it's only running them on our development instance. And this is the way that we, in effect, this is the way we stand up a local site to run the. We can run the whole provision and deploy process locally, without paying attention to anything else. So that lets us rule out number 2. So we've satisfied that requirement, at least in theory, and we can move on to the third item. So we need to be able to provide host-specific variables to the different hosts. So aside from groups, Ansible has this concept of group variables. And this is a nice feature. It allows you to assign variables per group, so that inventory file could have more than one group, and you can assign variables just to them. And it's a bit like PHP's class autoloading because it all happens in the file system. You don't actually have to do much to make this work. The development group that our local server belongs to was called deploy dev in that inventory file. If we create a variables file, in the way Ansible likes in YAML, that is named deploy dev, or if we create a file that lives in a directory called deploy dev, all the variables there will be made available to Ansible when the playbook runs on that host. So we name the files the right way and put them in the right position, and they become automatically available. So the right position is they need to live in a place called group vars, but aside from that, it's just by file name. And again, from the inventory file, there we go. There's that deploy dev. That's where we defined this group. So a file with that name living inside a directory called group vars, all those variables become available to Ansible, but only for this group. So more or less for free, we can cross off number 3. And the sort of last part of our basic requirements is that we be able to do the same thing as I just described, but with secrets. So again, maybe database passwords or what have you. There's lots of secrets we have to work with. And this is another sort of another one of the tools in the basic sort of Ansible install, and it's called Ansible Vault. And this is a tool for encrypting variables and or files in advance, and then for being able to decrypt them when the playbook actually runs, so that the real contents of them are made available to the playbooks. As with the rest of them, there's a command line switch for enabling this. The point of this is that it's sort of designed with the purpose in mind of storing your secrets in source control, which I know is a shocking idea. It's supposed to be strong encryption, though I'm not sure that I know anybody who does this with public repositories. But if you have an encrypted blob, one of these Ansible Vault files in the playbook directory, and if it's named according to the group variables convention that I just outlined, it'll be made available, automatically decrypted, and then the values will be supplied. So this means we can do things like provide different database passwords, or even different, for example, development and production SSL keys to the different hosts on the deployment. So we're able to, in effect, split out what we need from one environment and from what we need in another environment, and use the same command to run the job in both places. One last thing about this. This is how these files actually look. Another short video. This one's harder to show you because with the last screen captures, the vault password was already provided in a way that's in a different way. But if you don't provide this thing when you've got encrypted content in the playbook directory, about what you'd expect happens, and that is, it barfs. If you then just continue and there we go, give it what it's asking for, just the path to a file containing the password, it will run on ahead. This is normally the way that you would do it in a fully automated deployment. It's also possible to to have Ansible prompt for the passwords directly. But the best way to get a robot to do it is to give it a file with a password in it. So that is basically the end of the requirements. So in principle, we should be able to do this. We've got all the capabilities to do all the things we really need to do. So we should think at least a little bit about the tasks that we would be doing on the inside of a play, on the inside of a playbook. And in this instance, this is a Drupal conference. We'll say something about how they relate specifically to Drupal. So one of the first things is running build tasks. Depending on exactly what you're deploying, how you like to deploy it, you may very well be running Composer at some stage. You might need to run gulp or grunt tasks if you don't store, if, for example, you don't store CSS or minified JS in the repository. If you just build them, if you just want to create those at build time, you might have to run those tasks. Aside from that, we have to transfer the code base, and again, which order this happens in depends on your process, but we'll have to get the code base out to the server, whether it's the local or whether it's dev or whether it's prod. You've got to get the code base out there. We might do that using rsync, as in my code sample. You might do it using Git. We're going to have to customize files. This is kind of a big one. In Drupal, for example, as I mentioned before, we have, for example, a settings file, settings.php. If you're not using a local settings file, then we might just replace individual lines, individual passwords inside, or say the hash salt, inside settings.php. On the other hand, if your build contains specific or needs to contain specific local settings file per host, then we could just write them out separately. They could be an entirely separate file that's deployed to each host. And then finally, we're going to have to execute commands. Drupal in particular does a lot of this, of course. As soon as the code base changes, we're going to want to update the database. We're going to want to maybe import config. We'll want to clear caches, all those things. So we need to be able to do this sort of set of things on any sort of reasonable deployment. And again, you can see which things we actually do in this code repo at that file. So just a few more of these Ansible tasks. Running, for example, npx gulp build, it just looks like that. This is the same one I showed you earlier. Again, it's just running the command exactly the same way that you would if you typed it in on the command line. Transferring the code base, again, for the purposes of demonstration, I'm just using Ansible's wrapper around rsync, called synchronize. And this it does what you'd expect. It synchronizes from source to destination, and it obeys the sort of usual rsync conventions. So if you put a filter file in the repository to say which files should and should not be transferred, it'll pay attention to those and do it properly. Customizing files. This one is a big one, and you can tell how big of one it is by how many different tools are available in Ansible for it. There are tools for all of these things. One, replacing individual lines in a file, so that settings.php case that I mentioned would work well for that. There's tool for replacing blocks in a file, so the same thing but just with a bigger chunk of code. You might, for example, output the entire database connection variable with that if you wanted. Another one is template, which uses Jinja 2 style templating for taking a file with template strings and then replacing those strings with the values or secrets that you need according to host. And then finally, they've also got a copy module where if you had, for example, as I mentioned earlier, a different local settings file that you needed to deploy to each different host, as sometimes happens, then you could keep those in your repository and just deploy each one where it belonged as it's required. And this is an example of that's an example of a template task there. Just a source and a destination. Again, all the variable replacement logic is pretty much handled by those groups and group variables. And then lastly, executing commands. As I mentioned, Drupal has lots of needs to do this. This would also be useful for if you want to take the simple route for importing the database on your initial build or on a sort of recovery build, and draw SQL CLI and point it at the latest dump, though Ansible also provides database-specific modules just for that. So this is the basics. You can do this thing, and it works fairly well, again, if your sort of setup suits what these tools can do. But I'm going backwards. There are side benefits. So you can get a little extra out of this, even beyond just what I mentioned before. So again, what we wanted and what we found was useful about this is you get the one-line build that works regardless of your environment. You can run it manually, you can run it as part of your automated builds. You get to simplify your initial build and maybe your rebuild and definitely your deployments. And you also get this sort of visibility into the deployment process for developers, because if you make them interact with this at least a little bit to set up their environment, they can see it. But that's not that useful visibility-wise if they don't see it all the time. So one thing you can do with a setup like this is make developers see it all the time. So how many people know about Git hooks? Good. So for those that don't, a Git hook is just a way of running a command, running a script on a Git action. So you might run, for example, SAS linting on Git commit. Anybody's ever worked with SAS lint? No? Some? Yeah. So I find with that thing, you've got it running on a watch command off in another window somewhere, and it's yelling at you about all these sort of warnings that it's got for what you've just done in the SAS syntax. But you don't see them, and you commit the code, and then you push it up, and then somebody reviews it and says, you made all these errors that the linter would have told you about. Why did you do that? So, of course, that's never happened to me. So you can run scripts on the Git actions as an alternative or an addition. And you can be used to run sort of tests or linting. Now, if you're thinking ahead, I've just been showing you how to do an automated deployment to a local machine. And some of you are probably screaming inside and thinking, you're not telling me to do this on every commit, are you? And no, I'm not. But even if I was, you don't have to do what I tell you, because there's a way to get out of it. When you've got a Git hook that's meant to run on a task or run on a Git action, and you don't want it to happen, you can just specify this no verify flag and bypass the hook altogether. So in this repository, I've created a pre-push hook, which means it's going to deploy the app locally and basically see if that works. There's a couple of small tests in the end of the deployment that I've written for this repo that if they fail, they'll cause the command, they'll cause the push operation to fail, and it won't actually get pushed to the remote. And that gives you an opportunity to sort of correct it before all your colleagues have seen the problem. And it looks like this. Well, this might be kind of a long one. I'll show you the start. If anybody really wants to see it, we can show it. We can see it at the end. I don't know if I can jump ahead in the video. We'll leave it be. In any case, it's going to run this whole deployment. Spoiler alert again, this deployment succeeds, so all that's going to happen at the end is the normal Ansible output, and then the few lines of code that you see when you do a git push from the command line. This video is about 1.5 minutes long, so it's not a particularly sort of onerous process, as long as you're not pushing every single commit. And again, if you are, you can probably use the flag to skip them. And that looks like that, and this is a shorter process. This is the one extra argument in the command returns you back to the sort of familiar process. Right? It's already done before I'm even finished saying it. So, I'm going to go 2 slides ahead and show you. This is what the sample repo that we've got in here does. It's basically, as I said, it's an index page. It's just a simple static HTML site, but it demonstrates that we can put dynamic content into this page and that we can vary it per host. So both the CSS and the host name that are shown in the colored boxes there, they're different. Those come from those group variables that we mentioned earlier. That is basically all I got. So we can go to questions now, if anybody has any. And while we do that, no, this is my fake demo. I'm just going to get this to run in the background. So, anybody got any questions? Go.
So how do you handle new services?
For example, sorry, the question was how do we handle new services, like Solar? So I mentioned that at the beginning. It depends a little bit on what specifically it is and how sort of how complex the build needs to be. This is the sort of thing that can be a reason not to make this not available. But if it's fairly simple, you could have a little Solar, like another little Solar instance defined with, a Solar server defined using Vagrant. You will find that your RAM starts to run out very fast if you do a lot of that. But there's nothing to stop you from doing multiple machines in Vagrant in one file. So this code repo, the production server that it uses is in Vagrant too, just so that we don't have to have an actual remote server for the purpose of demonstration. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Well, it's more a question of like you are making applications for third party needs different specifications, different services that you use. Sometimes it needs like Solar, sometimes it doesn't.
Yes.
But maybe later in the project the client wants it.
Mm-hmm.
Wants a faster search. But maybe your like this template or deployment of Figma doesn't have that. So
Mm-hmm. Well, So again, the continuing question is sort of how do we build on these new features once. Yeah. So this is a problem that has to be solved on prod anyway. That's sort of my whole reason for sort of working this back to front way in the first place. So you can set it up in the deployment process on in the local repository using a virtual machine, or you could, build it out on QA if you wanted to have the sort of, if you wanted to keep those processes separate. But we're going to write, in this kind of case, we're going to write automation to deploy this service to some production environment anyway. And then, so we can write that against the local environment and then use it for prod. Anybody else? No, I don't. It's probably faster. Oh, sorry. The question was, Docker can also be used for this. Is that about right? Yeah. So this is true. As I mentioned back at the beginning, these are the tools that I actually know and am sort of familiar enough with to sort of put all this together. Part of what I like about this is we aren't using we're not using Docker in production in any place that it would fit this model. So if we were, I would totally want to start using Docker in a process like this. So again, so we'd be running as similar a set of things locally as possible to the remote. Again, where the complexity doesn't rule that out. So I mean, if we have, a stack of database servers and webheads and load balancers and stuff, I'm not building that on my local machine. Yeah, you can run Docker inside Vagrant. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yes. So would the question be, can you get like a nice... Mm-hmm. Okay. So I guess the question is, can we get sort of nice usable sort of like logging or sort of output out of Ansible commands? Basically, yes. Though what you do, I mean, it's quite variable. You can, it's common to assign a variable to an Ansible task. And if that task has iterated over multiple hosts, for example, the resulting variable will have entries for each host and each value. And so the common output for these is JSON. So if you can parse JSON with something else, or if you want to write it to the file system, or if you want to run Ansible from inside another thing that maybe has database credentials and can actually do the writing from there. You could do probably what you can imagine, or what you want to do. You can probably find a way. Any more? No? Alrighty.